Snow fell in slow, deliberate spirals outside the log cabin, each flake catching the dim light that seeped through the frosted windows. Inside, the smell of burning pine logs and gun oil mingled in the warm air. Sophia Hayes, barely 12 years old, sat cross-legged on the wooden floor, her small hands wrapped around the cold steel of a rifle twice her size. Her father, Robert Hayes, crouched beside her, his voice calm but firm. "Again," he said, placing a gloved hand over hers to adjust her grip. "It's not about hitting the mark when it's easy, sophomore. It's about doing it when the snow blinds you, the wind bites, and your body wants to quit." She nodded, not because she fully understood yet, but because she trusted him. Trust came naturally when the man teaching you had survived 3 tours overseas, earning a reputation as one of the deadliest long-range marksmen in the military. Robert wasn't just a soldier. He was a hunter of both game and opportunity, a man who knew the land's moods as if it breathed and whispered secrets to him. Life in Alaska's interior demanded more from a person than most could imagine. The Hayes family cabin sat 50 miles from the nearest neighbor, reachable only by bush plane in summer or snowmobile in winter. Out here, the wilderness didn't forgive mistakes. The forest stretched endlessly, the rivers were as cold and fast as steel cables, and the mountains guarded their secrets with ice and shadow. It was in this place, isolated, unpredictable, and brutally honest, that Sophia learned to survive. Her schooling came in thick manila envelopes, sent once a month. The assignments were important, but they were secondary to her real lessons. Tracking elk through snowstorms, reading the story told by a bent blade of grass, learning the patience to wait hours for a single clean shot. Robert believed in 2 kinds of education, the kind that taught you to read the world on paper, and the kind that taught you to read it in the wind, the soil, and the movements of living things. By 14, she could follow the faintest blood trail for miles, recognizing when a wounded caribou veered off not because of injury, but because it had caught the scent of a wolf. By 15, she could make a clean shot on a moving target nearly a kilometer away, compensating for the icy wind without even thinking about the math behind it. Her father didn't measure success by the kill itself, but by the discipline behind it. One evening, while they huddled by the fire after a long day tracking a bull moose, Robert leaned back in his chair and said, "Most people think the rifle is a sniper's greatest tool. They're wrong. The real weapon is here." He tapped his temple. "And here." He pressed a hand over his chest. "Without the patience to wait, the courage to hold your fire when you should, and the grit to act when you must, the rifle's just metal and powder." Sophia took his word seriously. She listened as he told her about his deployments, stories not of glory, but of decisions that kept men alive or haunted him for years. He spoke of the weight that came with knowing a single pull of the trigger could save one life while ending another. He never spoke in absolutes. There was no such thing as an easy choice in his world. When her mother passed away in a winter car accident, the isolation deepened. Robert turned his full attention to raising her, and the wilderness became both her playground and her proving ground. She learned to climb sheer, icy ridges with 50 pounds of gear strapped to her back, to make a fire with wet tinder in sub-zero temperatures, and to move through the forest so quietly even the squirrels didn't notice her passing. By 16, she could disappear into the terrain and live off the land for weeks, without a soul knowing she was there. That skill, the ability to vanish, would one day save not just her life, but the lives of others who didn't yet believe in her. Sophia didn't see herself as extraordinary back then. She was simply her father's daughter, doing what she had always done. But Robert knew. He could see the way she read the land like a map only she could decipher, how she adapted to change without panic, and how her hand stayed steady under pressure. It wasn't just about survival. He was shaping her into something rare, a marksman who could think 3 moves ahead, someone who could see not just the shot in front of her, but the battle unfolding around it. By the time she turned 18, she had a choice. She could take over her father's guiding business, leading hunters and adventurers into the backcountry, or she could put her skills to the test in a world where lives depended on them in ways even Alaska couldn't match. The decision came one autumn morning. She and Robert had been tracking a grizzly that had wandered too close to a fishing camp. It was dangerous work. Grizzlies didn't give second chances, but the moment came when she had the bear in her sights. She held her breath, finger resting on the trigger, when the wind shifted. The bear paused, turned, and slowly walked away into the trees. She didn't fire. Robert said nothing for a long while. Then, as they packed up, he looked at her and smiled faintly. "You're ready," he said. "Not because you can shoot, because you know when not to." That night, Sophia decided. She would enlist, not to prove something to others, but to test herself in the harshest proving ground there was, one where the stakes were measured in lives, and hesitation could mean failure. She had no idea then that the world she was stepping into would see her skills, doubt them, and force her to fight not just for survival, but for the right to stand alongside those who thought she didn't belong. But the wilderness had already prepared her for that fight. The day Sophia Hayes stepped onto the training grounds of the military base, she could feel the difference in the air compared to the wild expanse of Alaska, where she had spent her youth. And while the cold up north bit at the skin and taught her endurance, the air here carried the weight of disciplined structure and the watchful eyes of those ready to judge her every move. And in those early moments, she already sensed that her greatest battle would not be the grueling drills or the miles of running under the punishing sun, but the silent war against the assumptions written on the faces of her instructors and fellow recruits as they looked at her slight frame and calm demeanor and quietly placed her in the category of those who would need protecting rather than those who could lead the charge. In truth, she was already years ahead of many who stood beside her in the formation, but she knew the path to proving it would be longer than any march in. The schedule, her first marksmanship test came within the week, and the recruits were handed standard-issue rifles before being lined up at the range, where instructors called out distances that stretched far enough to blur the edges of the target for most eyes. And as the reports of gunfire filled the air, Sophia moved through her shots with the same patience her father had drilled into her over countless winters. Tracking elk through blizzards, she adjusted for wind without needing the small digital devices others relied on. She read the subtle shimmer in the air above the range to gauge heat distortion, and she fired each round as if the rifle was an extension of her own breathing. When the scores were tallied, she stood at the top with a clean run, and instructors exchanged glances, some impressed, others clearly unsettled that a newcomer and a woman had just outshot everyone by a wide margin. But for Sophia, it was only one small step in a much larger climb, because while skill on the range was undeniable, the real challenge lay in earning trust during field exercises where physical endurance, tactical awareness, and adaptability were tested to the breaking point. During simulated missions through dense terrain, she moved like water around obstacles, vanishing from sight and reappearing exactly where her team needed her to be. Her awareness stretched beyond the immediate objective, reading patterns in the environment that hinted at hidden threats her teammates often missed. Yet, even as she pulled them out of simulated ambushes or guided them along safer routes, the instructors praised the team's performance without mentioning her name, and she learned quickly that recognition would not come easily, if at all. In those days, she found herself under the command of various officers, each with their own way of making it clear that her role was temporary or peripheral. One, in particular, Captain Harris, a tall, broad man with the booming voice of someone used to being obeyed, made no effort to hide his doubts. He often reassigned her to positions he considered safer, far from the main assault routes, leaving her as overwatch or on defensive perimeters, while others advanced into mock firefights. And though Sophia understood the value of overwatch, she also knew these decisions came not from tactical necessity, but from the quiet prejudice that frontline combat was a place for men alone rather than argue. She kept her voice steady, accepted her orders, and used the time to study the decisions made by her superiors, dissecting each plan for weaknesses and filing away lessons for the future. She trained harder than anyone else, rising before dawn to run weighted drills, perfecting her aim under low light and heavy fatigue conditions, and practicing the mental exercises her father had taught her to keep her mind sharp under strain. It was during one night exercise in the forest that she finally began to break through the wall of underestimation. The objective was simple: in theory, capture a mock enemy position without being detected. And Sophia's unit was given the flank route through a section of forest so dense it swallowed sound and light. The team leader decided to move quickly, believing speed would reduce the risk of detection, but Sophia could see the flaws in this approach. The enemy's patrol patterns left small gaps in coverage, and by slowing their pace and timing their movements to those gaps, they could reach the objective unseen. She voiced this suggestion quietly to the leader, who dismissed it and pushed forward at full speed. Within minutes, they triggered tripwire alarms and found themselves pinned down by simulated fire from multiple angles, while the rest of the team scrambled. Sophia moved independently using the cover of darkness to slip away from the noise and circle behind the enemy lines. In less than 10 minutes, she had neutralized the mock guards from an unseen position and signaled her team to advance. When they regrouped at the captured objective, the evaluators noted the decisive move, and though the leader took credit, more than one instructor had seen her work firsthand, it wasn't a complete victory in the fight for respect, but it was a fracture in the barrier, and she knew cracks spread when pressure was applied. Over the months that followed, Sophia built a quiet reputation among the few who paid attention. She was the one who spotted the barely visible tripwire in a mock village before the squad entered. She was the one who adjusted a team's firing positions mid-exercise, preventing them from being flanked. She was the one who, during a grueling week-long field survival test, returned with twice the required supplies, having read the land for food and water sources others had walked past without noticing. And yet, for every success, there was still the lingering sense that she was an anomaly rather than a standard to be measured against. The turning point in training came during an advanced marksmanship challenge that paired shooting with navigation under timed conditions. The course demanded recruits move through rugged terrain, hitting targets at various distances without any given path or clear line of sight. It was a test designed to push even experienced shooters into mistakes and exhaustion, and by the halfway mark, many had already missed key targets or fallen behind on time. Sophia moved through it as if the terrain were her own backyard, using gullies for concealment, calculating wind through the rustle of leaves and the drift of dust, and never once rushing a shot. Each round struck cleanly, and her final time beat the previous record by nearly 3 full minutes. This time the instructors could not ignore her performance, nor could the other recruits, who began to see her not just as the quiet woman from Alaska, but as someone whose results spoke louder than the doubt in their voices. Still, the skepticism did not vanish overnight, and Sophia understood it might never fully fade for some, but her time in training had proven one thing beyond question: she had the endurance, the skill, and the mental steel to stand in the same fight as anyone else. And when orders came assigning her to a special operations support unit, she accepted, knowing that it was only the first step into a far larger proving ground, where she would face not just the enemy, but the shadows of assumption that followed her into every mission. The first time Sophia met Commander Michael Hayes, she recognized the type immediately, a man forged in the old-school traditions of military command, where physical dominance and an aggressive approach to combat were held above all else, and where skepticism toward change, especially in the form of women serving in frontline special operations, was worn almost as a badge of honor. And though he was not unkind in tone, his eyes carried that subtle weight of dismissal, the kind that didn't need to be spoken to be understood. He had the presence of someone who had spent nearly 2 decades leading men through high-risk operations, earning his stripes and his scars along the way. And in his mind, the chain of command was not a place for debate or deviation from orders, especially from someone he saw as an untested addition to his team. Their introduction came during the pre-mission briefing for an operation codenamed Silent Hawk, a classified mission that intelligence analysts described as a high-value opportunity deep in hostile territory. The objective was to locate and eliminate a regional insurgent leader believed responsible for coordinating multiple attacks on coalition forces, and the mission's success depended on speed, precision, and the element of surprise. The plan Hayes laid out was straightforward on paper: a rapid infiltration by his 8-man team through dense forest terrain to the target compound, with Sophia assigned to a distant overwatch position more than 800 meters from the objective, where she would be tasked only with monitoring movement and engaging any threats attempting to escape. And though the placement was tactically safe, Sophia saw immediately that it also limited her ability to provide real-time support should the assault team face heavy resistance. She studied the terrain map, noting the ridgelines and the narrow approach corridors to the compound, and she suggested moving her position to a higher elevation where she could cover both the approach and potential escape routes. Her tone was respectful and her reasoning sound, but Hayes shut her down with a tight jaw and clipped words, reminding her that he had been running operations like this long before she had ever fired a shot in combat, and that orders were not a subject for negotiation. She gave no sign of frustration, yet inside she was already running through contingency plans, because in her experience the forest often hid truths the maps and aerial images could not show. The insertion began under cover of darkness, with the team moving swiftly through the undergrowth, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and pine. Sophia settled into the position Hayes had chosen, setting up her rifle and scanning the compound through her scope. At first everything appeared as expected: clusters of buildings ringed by defensive structures, with guard positions faintly visible in the breaks between trees. But as she extended her search outward into the surrounding forest, she began to spot subtle details the others had missed: faintly trampled vegetation, suggesting concealed footpaths, oddly uniform patches of foliage that broke the natural pattern, and the glint of metal that no rock or branch could explain. She tracked slow, deliberate movements through the trees, counting at least a dozen armed fighters outside the compound in well-concealed positions, far more than the intelligence brief had estimated, and the precision of their placement told her they were not just patrolling, but lying in wait, and she recognized the layout of an ambush forming in the very corridor Hayes' team was using. She relayed the warning quietly over comms, describing the positions and movement, but Hayes replied with a calm insistence that there was no immediate threat visible from the ground, and instructing her to maintain her role and hold fire. Sophia kept her voice neutral, but her decision was already made. She was not going to sit idle while the team walked into a kill box. The first burst of gunfire confirmed her fears as the forest erupted with flashes and the sharp staccato crack of automatic weapons. The team, caught in open ground between the compound and the treeline with no solid cover, were forced into a reactive defense, returning fire from exposed positions. The enemy moved with practiced coordination, closing off escape routes while tightening the crossfire, and Sophia saw clearly that without intervention the entire team would be overrun in minutes. She began to reposition using natural cover and the faint animal trails that laced through the terrain, each step measured for silencer, pack, and rifle, shifting with the practiced balance of years spent moving through unforgiving wilderness. The location she chose required a steep climb up a rocky outcrop, but from there she could see every hostile position while remaining nearly invisible herself. She set her rifle down, adjusted for wind drift filtered through the forest canopy, and took aim at the figure directing the ambush. The leader stood partially obscured, but the rhythm of his gestures and the chatter into his radio made him unmistakable. She let her breath slip halfway out, squeezed, and watched him drop. Instantly the enemy's coordination faltered, and she shifted quickly to a machine gunner whose fire was pinning Hayes' medic. Another shot, another body. Down the ambush line broke further as fighters turned in confusion, trying to locate the unseen marksman. One by one she picked them off, each engagement requiring quick recalculation for shifting wind and the varying density of foliage between her and the target. Every kill was surgical, efficient, and unhurried. Despite the chaos below, she intercepted flanking attempts, cut down retreating fighters, and disrupted every effort to regroup. By the time she fired her 12th shot, the forest had fallen eerily, still broken only by the distant shouts of the assault team as they advanced toward the now weakened compound. Hayes' voice finally came over the radio, edged with disbelief as he asked her position, and she replied simply that the threat had been neutralized and the area was clear after the primary target was eliminated without further incident. The extraction flight carried a silence heavier than the gear they carried. Hayes sat across from her, his eyes fixed on her as though seeing her for the first time. In truth, the clash between them had not ended, but it had transformed. She had forced him to acknowledge the reality that capability was not defined by his preconceptions, and though neither spoke of it in that moment, a shift had occurred in the way he regarded her, a shift that would change everything in the missions to come. The moment the first hostile fell, the tempo of the battle changed, but the danger was far from over, and from her vantage point Sophia could see the chaos spreading through the enemy ranks as they scrambled to locate her firing position while still trying to maintain pressure on the assault team. Trapped in the clearing below, the forest that had moments earlier been their cover had now turned into a maze of fear and uncertainty for them, and Sophia knew that panic could be as deadly a weapon as the bullet itself. She shifted her scope to track a fighter attempting to reposition a light machine gun to a higher slope where he could resume suppressive fire on Hayes' men. The shot was long and the angle steep, but the opening was clean, and she let her training take over, slowing her breathing until her heartbeat matched the rhythm she needed for a steady trigger squeezed the man crumpled before the barrel of his weapon settled into place, and she immediately swept her sights to the right, catching. Movement from two more fighters flanking low through a drainage gully. Their route would bring them up behind the assault team within moments, but before they could close the gap, she dropped them in rapid succession, two sharp cracks blending into the din of the fight. The change in enemy momentum was palpable. The tight crossfire pattern began to unravel as fighters broke cover in disorganized sprints, some retreating, others attempting to find positions to return fire at an opponent they could not see. Sophia exploited each moment of exposure, calculating the variable wind that funneled unpredictably through the trees, the deflection on each shot changing by inches. That meant everything at her distances. She cycled through targets with clinical efficiency, a runner darting through a cluster of trees, two more breaking from a defensive trench, a sniper on the far ridge who had just exposed his position with a muzzle flash all gone. In the space of a breath for each of them, her mind ran the familiar silent checklist: distance, wind, target movement, environmental obstructions, mental stillness, and execution. There was no rush, no panic, only precision, because she knew that panic was for those who hadn't already done the work long before the fight began below her. Hayes's team began to push forward the reduction in incoming fire, giving them the opening they desperately needed to maneuver into stronger positions, but there were still pockets of resistance, and Sophia's attention was drawn to a trio of fighters hunkered behind a fallen log, exchanging bursts with one of the SEALs, whose cover was deteriorating by the second. The fighters were smart. Only one exposed himself at a time, while the others reloaded and scanned for flanking threats. It was a coordinated defense designed to bleed the assault team's advance dry. She studied the geometry of their cover, noting a narrow corridor through the branches overhead, a 6-inch gap, barely visible unless you were looking for it, but just wide enough to thread around through. She waited for the moment one of them leaned back to shout to his comrades, and then took the shot. The fighter's body slumped into the log, and the others faltered just long enough for Hayes's men to advance and eliminate them. She was already shifting focus again, spotting two hostiles breaking away from the fight, entirely retreating deeper into the forest, perhaps to regroup or perhaps to report the engagement. She could not allow either to happen. Her scope tracked the first easily enough, but the second required her to lead the target through dense brush, timing the shot to intercept him as he passed between two tree trunks. In less than a second both were down, and the fight's outcome had tipped decisively in their favor. The remaining fighters broke and ran, abandoning the compound to its fate, and within moments Hayes's team had secured the perimeter. Sophia exhaled slowly, letting the edges of her focus widen again as she scanned for any last threats. The forest was still now, the acrid smell of spent gunpowder hanging in the cold air, and the faint hiss of wind through the trees, replacing the thunder of rifles. When Hayes's voice came through the calms, there was a hesitation in it, a pause that carried the weight of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. "Phantom," he said, using her call sign, "whatever you just did out there, you saved every one of us." But Sophia gave no victory speech. She simply confirmed the area was clear and reminded him they had a primary objective to complete. The team moved into the compound, finding the high-value target and his counsel exactly where intelligence had placed them. The assault was swift, decisive, and without the earlier ambush their resistance crumbled quickly. Minutes later the extraction bird was inbound, the sound of its rotors growing until the treetops swayed as it descended. Hayes's men filed aboard, each carrying the fatigue of adrenaline spent and the weight of knowing how close they had come to disaster. Hayes sat across from her again in the cramped cargo bay, his gaze steady, now stripped of the earlier skepticism. For a moment the roar of the helicopter seemed to fade as he leaned forward enough for her to hear him over the noise. "I was wrong," he said with a directness that surprised her. "I've never seen shooting like that, not in my 20 years. And you didn't just keep your head, you changed the entire fight in less than 5 minutes. You have my respect." That was all he said, but in his eyes she could see the beginning of something that mattered more than any official commendation, trust built in the heat of battle that no amount of training or policy could manufacture. Sophia only nodded, but inside she knew this was the crack in the wall she had been pushing against since her first day in uniform, a wall built from assumptions and guarded by those who could not imagine someone like her standing at the sharpest edge of combat. Yet here she was, and in the span of 5 relentless minutes she had made sure no one on that helicopter would ever forget it. In the weeks after the mission that had changed everything, Sophia felt the current of transformation ripple through the command corridors with the slow but undeniable pull of a tide. And though no one declared it outright, the tone of conversation shifted, and the questions aimed at her now carried curiosity instead of dismissal. After-action reviews were circulated across units, and the sections detailing her choices became mandatory. Study for any team expected to operate in forests, mountains, or regions where sightlines could fracture into 1,000 shifting shadows. The official commendation arrived without ceremony, a promotion that felt not like a gift, but like an overdue acknowledgement. Yet the deeper change was visible in subtle ways, in the nods from seasoned operators who once overlooked her, in the invitations to planning sessions where her voice was sought early rather than as an afterthought, and in the fact that her suggestions were now weighed on their merit rather than filtered through the lens of her gender. Commander Michael Hayes made a point of championing her inclusion whenever new initiatives were discussed, insisting that the force needed not only strong bodies, but sharp patience forged under real pressure. He pushed for her to design and lead an advanced marksmanship and fieldcraft program, and while some clung to the image of a lecture hall where one authoritative voice commanded from the front, Sophia broke that pattern completely. She built the course like a living landscape, each module its own terrain with weather risks and demands, and she asked her students to navigate it like hunters in unfamiliar country, slow at first, learning the feel of the ground, the scent in the air, and the sound of the wind, then decisive. When the moment for action arrived, her lessons rarely began with a rifle in hand. Instead, she took the class into the woods at dawn and told them to listen until their heartbeat faded beneath the noise of the world, to notice a leaf returning to stillness after a bird took flight, to feel the cooler air spilling down a slope, and to hear the faintest scrape of fabric in the distance. On the range, she placed targets in awkward angles, hidden behind partial cover, lit only by fractured light, and she taught them to read wind through grass movement, to taste humidity, and to think of time not as an enemy, but as an ally in control. She made them practice restraint, passing on shots that looked perfect but revealed their position or endangered their team, and she charted their decisions in a journal, so she could walk through each choice later in private conversations, where the real lessons settled in words spread quickly until operators from multiple branches were requesting slots in her classes, and the wait list stretched long enough that she had to balance teaching with active field deployments. In those deployments, she and Hayes developed a rhythm of respectful friction, his instinct for swift, decisive strikes meeting her deep, layered mapping of risk and opportunity, each learning from the other, until their combined approach began shaping missions in subtle but decisive ways. One windy afternoon, as a class packed their gear, Hayes watched the trainees move out with sharper patience than they had arrived, and he told her quietly that patience is its own form of speed. Within a year, her training methods were being codified into doctrine manuals, now spoke of sensory baselining and flexible overwatch, not as static support, but as a dynamic element that could shape a battle long before the first shot. And when she was tasked with drafting cross-branch sniper guidance, she argued that the greatest weakness was not between services, but between the plan on paper and the reality on the ground. Her work was adopted across the force, and instructors she had never met wrote to tell her how their students had learned to mark time differently and choose with more discipline than before. She kept those letters in a slim folder as reminders that skill is stewardship, not self-display. In the winter, she was formally named head of the sniper program, with the mandate to shape it for the next decade, and she overhauled selection to look beyond tight shot groupings, to find minds that could hold a problem without rushing to solve it. She built stress scenarios that forced candidates to plan with minimal sleep and shifting constraints, and to operate in moral gray zones where the right choice carried its own cost. In the same season, she addressed a room full of commanders, telling them that the enemy studies our ego and baits it, and that if they clung to outdated ideas of who could be decisive, they handed the advantage away. She did not mention her own turning point in the forest, yet every leader there knew the story. After the talk, a young officer admitted he had once thought inclusion was a distraction, but now saw it as a competitive edge. She told him the point was not inclusion for its own sake, but a commitment to reality. Talent does not choose where it is born, And if a culture cannot see that it will lose to one, that can her life outside the school remain simple, she rose before dawn, walked the perimeter, brewed her coffee in a dented tin, and kept a single photograph on her desk of her father, by a river, just before the freeze, his faint smile caught in the corner of his mouth. She called him, when she could, and told him little of missions, but much of what she was building one evening after a long course rotation. She received a message from Emma, a former student now deployed in difficult country. It said, "We used the breathing drill, the one where you match pulse to wind. It bought us the seconds to break contact. It saved Miguel. And maybe me too. Thank you, Sophia." Read it twice before replying. "Keep teaching your team the way you wish you had been taught." Months later, a ceremony was held on a parade ground shimmering with heat, and Hayes pinned another rank to her chest, telling the assembled crowd that capability is defined by who shows up when the stakes are highest, and that the force would be judged not just by what it does, but by who it allows to do it. That night the team gathered behind a low building and shared stories in the easy quiet of those who had faced death together. Hayes asked what she wanted to build next, and she answered, without pause, a school not of just targets and scores, but of judgment, patience, humility, and the courage to take responsibility for the irreversible. And when that school opened on a wooded range, students learned that the craft of a sniper is not the shot, but the vision behind it. They learned to read the wind as language, to build a mental map from the smallest of signs, and to see restraint as a strength rather than a hesitation. Graduates carried that mindset into units around the world, and over time the culture shifted quietly until the question of who belonged in the fight no longer sounded like a question at all. And when another mission came, she moved out with her team with the same steady nod she had given since her first day in uniform, because the work was the point, and the point was simple: let skill speak, and let results be the final word.